At a lively neighborhood party, where laughter and music filled the air, no one expected a quiet elderly man to take center stage. But when two officers arrived, their tone and actions quickly cast a shadow over the celebration. Their words dripped with prejudice, targeting a family that had done nothing wrong. Most people froze, unsure of what to do, until Mr. Henry, a soft-spoken retiree with a cane in hand, decided enough was enough. With unwavering courage, he stood tall, confronting the officers with a calm yet powerful voice that silenced the entire crowd. His words carried decades of wisdom and a deep sense of justice. The tension was palpable. No one could predict what would happen next. What followed left everyone stunned, and the ripple effects of that moment changed lives forever. Stay tuned as we unravel the emotional aftermath of this unforgettable act of bravery. As the crowd stood in stunned silence, Mr. Henry's voice carried over the murmurs, steady and clear. He recounted his own experiences, drawing from a time when he had witnessed injustice but felt powerless to act. "Not today," he said firmly, his gaze locked on the officers. His words weren't loud, but they struck like lightning, forcing everyone to reflect. The officers shifted uncomfortably, their initial arrogance fading as the weight of Mr. Henry's presence settled in. But who was this man? Many at the party only knew him as the kind neighbor who watered his garden and greeted everyone with a smile. Few knew about his past, a life shaped by battles fought quietly, not with fists but with an unshakable belief in fairness and humanity. The officers, caught off guard, hesitated. The tension thickened as the crowd began to stir, emboldened by Mr. Henry's courage. Something was about to give. As Mr. Henry stood his ground, the crowd's murmurs grew louder, like a wave of emotions building in unison. People began exchanging glances, questioning if they should step in or stay silent. Among them was Maria, a young woman who had seen enough injustice in her own life. She clenched her fists, her heart racing as she watched the unfolding scene. Nearby, her father, a factory worker who rarely spoke of his struggles, placed a hand on her shoulder, signaling caution. The officers, now visibly tense, scanned the crowd. "We're just doing our job," one of them said, but the defensive tone betrayed their earlier confidence. Mr. Henry didn't waver. "Doing your job shouldn't mean treating people like they're less than human," he said softly, his voice cutting through the noise like a sharp blade. The crowd began to shift, their silence breaking. Some nodded in agreement, others whispered words of support. But behind the tension, a lingering fear remained. What if standing up came with consequences? As the officers' radios crackled with static, their next move remained uncertain, and the energy in the air hinted at an outcome no one could predict. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their authority now overshadowed by the growing strength of the crowd. A subtle shift had taken place. What began as quiet fear had turned into a collective resolve. Mr. Henry, standing tall despite his frail frame, became the unspoken leader of this moment. His voice carried the weight of everyone's unspoken frustrations, their silent battles, and their hopes for something better. Maria, unable to stay still, took a step forward. "He's right," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "This is our community, and we deserve respect." Her words sent ripples through the crowd, igniting others to speak up. A man stepped closer, then another, each adding their voice to the rising wave of solidarity. The tension crackled like static electricity, ready to explode. The officers took a step back, their once commanding presence now faltering. One reached for his radio, speaking in hushed tones as the crowd edged closer. A young boy clung to his mother, his wide eyes filled with both fear and curiosity. The air felt heavy, charged with the possibility of something momentous about to happen. Mr. Henry, his hands steady on his cane, didn't flinch. He looked directly at the officers, his eyes carrying a quiet strength. "You have a choice," he said firmly. "Make the right one." The world seemed to pause, every breath held, as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Just as the tension seemed unbearable, a sharp voice cut through the crowd. "Wait, Everyone turned to see Mrs. Harris, an elderly woman known for her quiet demeanor, stepping forward. She held a phone in her hand, its screen glowing faintly. "I've been recording everything," she said, her voice steady but charged with purpose. The officers froze, their expressions shifting as the reality of their actions being documented sank in. The crowd murmured in approval, emboldened by Mrs. Harris' unexpected intervention. "This isn't going away," she continued, her voice rising. "You can't intimidate us into silence anymore." Her words sent a new wave of energy through the crowd, pushing the officers further into the corner they had created for themselves. But then, just as it seemed the officers might back down, a squad car pulled up. The flashing lights painted the scene in shades of red and blue, and a new figure stepped out, a senior officer, his face unreadable. He surveyed the situation with cold precision, his presence adding an unexpected twist. The crowd's murmurs quieted, uncertainty creeping back in. Mr. Henry didn't move, his resolve unshaken. "Let them try," he muttered under his breath, a hint of defiance in his tone. The new arrival's first words would determine everything. Would he escalate the situation or finally bring the justice they all hoped for? The crowd braced itself for what came next. The senior officer stepped forward, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. The crowd held its breath, tension thick in the air. He glanced at the two junior officers, his expression unreadable. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. The younger officers stumbled over their words, that earlier confidence replaced by unease. Before they could finish, Mr. Henry raised his voice, steady and unwavering. "What's going on," he said, "is your men came here with prejudice in their hearts, and we won't stand for it." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, even the senior officer seemed taken aback. He turned his attention to the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces, young and old, united by a shared purpose. Mrs. Harris stepped forward, holding her phone high. "It's all here," she said. "Every word, every action. We have the truth." The officer paused, his gaze shifting between the recording and the crowd that refused to back down. Finally, he sighed, his posture softening. "I'll handle this," he said quietly, motioning for the younger officers to follow him. Reluctantly, they retreated to the car, their arrogance replaced by silence. Just as relief began to wash over the crowd, the senior officer turned back to Mr. Henry. "You spoke with courage tonight," he said. "But remember, standing up isn't always enough. Make sure your voice keeps echoing." He tipped his hat, leaving behind words that struck deeper than any confrontation. As the squad car drove away, the crowd erupted in applause, their spirits lifted by the small victory. But Mr. Henry stood quietly, his eyes scanning the horizon. "This isn't the end," he murmured to Maria, who stood by his side now. "It's just the beginning." And with that, the seeds of change were firmly planted. As the crowd began to disperse, there was a quiet sense of pride in the air, a feeling that something meaningful had just happened. Neighbors who barely spoke to each other before now exchanged smiles and nods, united by the shared experience. Maria stood beside her father, their hands clasped, as if silently promising to always stand up for what's right. Mr. Henry, still leaning on his cane, watched everyone slowly return to their homes. Maria approached him, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. He smiled, his face lined with wisdom. "It wasn't just me," he replied. "It was all of us." Later that night, as the neighborhood settled back into quiet, Mr. Henry sat by his window, watching the stars. He felt a renewed hope, knowing that one small act of courage had sparked something far greater, a reminder that change begins with standing together.